we're going to be talking about current research that's going on, both laboratory stuff and then spontaneous case and questionnaire studies, because there has been, in Carlos's section talking about the history of the field, you can see that we started out with spontaneous experiences, people's experiences of ghosts and apparitions and precognitive dreams and so on. And there was a little bit of experimentation going on in the late 19th century, quite a bit more in the early 20th century, even some card guessing stuff being done that predated Dr. Rhine. But there was this movement towards, let's bring parapsychology into the laboratory, let's forget about what happens to people in life, except for what those experiences can suggest to us in terms of a new experiment that we might be able to do. In the last 20 years, the field has begun to move back in the other direction, where spontaneous cases are becoming more important in and of their own selves, and there's an effort to try and balance these two sides of the field. So that's basically where we're going to be going in this segment. Some of the things that were found out, or some of the things that were looked at over the history of the field, was forms of ESP. I guess psychokinesis would be a clock stopping. So these, what we'll do is we'll go right through these. These are the forms of spontaneous experiences, and these forms then gave rise to ideas of how we could test for ESP in the laboratory. So for instance, it became very obvious that ESP information could come through intuition, and intuition would be an unexamined urge to do something, or a feeling that something was happening, a feeling of dread, that kind of thing. I have an experience from my own family in which a relative woke up one morning with a terrible pain in her arm, roused her husband, and said, "We have to go because our daughter, something's happened to her. I know she's in pain. Something's wrong with her arm." Well, the daughter was 2 states away, 500 miles away at college. So he got up and protested all the way up there. Why are we doing this? Couldn't get in touch with her on the telephone. Had no reason to think that there was something wrong with her. Got to the dorm as she was returning to the dorm from the infirmary because she had fallen and broken her arm. So there was this urge for the mother to get up there, and it also had part of the somatic sensation, because the beginning of this overwhelming need to go and see the daughter was pain in her own arm. And she immediately associated it with the daughter and knew, I don't care, it's 500 miles, we have to get in that car, we have to go. So off they went. Hallucinations are like the case that Carlos mentioned to you, where the visual field is replaced by a vision of something happening somewhere else. Dreams, we all know what those are, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what people have found out about how ESP comes through in dreams. Behaviors may be similar to this idea of an urge moving you to do something, and it may be something as simple as avoiding something. We have a tape here by Rex Stanford, who proposed a theory many years ago that has a very long name. It's called psi-mediated instrumental response, and what that means is you unconsciously take a turn or do something that saves you from having some negative experience or takes you to some positive experience. But you're not aware of where that came from, and you're not really aware of why you're engaging in this sort of strange behavior. The American Society for Psychical Research across the park has been collecting 9/11 related cases since the event happened. And one of the things that they're interested in are these PMIR type cases, these unconscious things. They're very difficult to decide in terms of spontaneous stuff. It's like you were saying earlier, so many people have so many urges on whatever day, and you assign it meaning afterwards when you see what you avoided or what didn't happen. They have a case of a guy who'd been driving to the World Trade from his house in Brooklyn for 25 years and got lost. Just got lost and kind of found himself going in the wrong direction on the way to work and was alive because of it. That's what Rex Stanford would call a possible psi-mediated instrumental response, one of these behaviors that's motivated maybe by some ESP information. Motor responses would be something similar. Psychokinesis, when we talk about psychokinesis as something that gives us information, it's like a clock stopping or a picture falling off the wall or something that says to you there's something wrong somewhere. So some physical event happens in your environment that you take as meaningful and is conveying some information to you. And then sometimes, as in the case of my relative, there's also this component of emotion. You're just full of dread, or you're full of anger, or you're full of fear, and you can't connect it to yourself, but then later you connect it to someone else. So there's all these kinds of things that we see in all of the cases that have been collected over the last 120 some years, and they all tell us something about what the content is of ESP and how it works, and possibly they give us ideas of things that we can test in the laboratory. The next slide. One of the things that J.B. Rhine and his team at Duke University wanted to do was try and remodel parapsychology on experimental psychology, and they really were looking at the kind of Skinnerian, you know, the conditioning kind of psychology that was being done in the 20s and the 30s. And they wanted to be able to take all these amorphous experiences that people were taking and kind of come up with something simple to do in the laboratory that would give you some evidence that yes, people had telepathy, yes, people had clairvoyance, yes, people could do precognition. And that's basically the empirical process that happens in every science. You gather background information, make observations in nature, you try to derive a hypothesis that you can test in the laboratory, and then you operationalize the hypothesis. By operationalizing, I mean that's your metaphor. We've got a guy that's got a precognition that his mother is in trouble on the other side of London, and he runs over there and saves her from something. We want to test that ability and see if it really happens. We want to test it in the laboratory. Well, Rhine's operationalism, his metaphor for that kind of very rich experience was to say, let's put the guy and his mother in the laboratory, let's give the guy some ESP cards. There's 5 symbols, we'll have 5 symbols, and they'll go through the pack, and we'll see if the mother can guess what he's looking at. We'll see if he can guess what the mother's looking at. Ryan actually got in a little bit of trouble at the beginning because a lot of the people who had been spontaneous case researchers said, please, this is okay, the kernel of the ability may be in this experiment, but how do you motivate the participants to care about the transmission of the face of these cards? And actually we see that in the research that was done with Eileen Garrett, that she found it very difficult to do very well in clairvoyance experiments in which they'd shuffle that card, stick it in a box, put it off in a corner and say, yes. If you put another person at the other end of that experiment and had that person try and send that card, then she had a better chance of getting the information and did fairly well on those, but still found it to be monumentally boring. At the beginning, the Rhine Laboratory tested, as Carl said, anybody that they could grab. And when I was first at the Rhine Center in the 80s, I actually, Carlos and I both met a guy who was himself in his 80s, and as an undergraduate student at Duke University had been a student work-study person who came into the Rhine Lab and did ESP card tests all day long for 63 cents a week. And all he did was guess cards, and the information went into the hopper. So you devise this metaphor, then you try to gather your data, you reorganize it so you can analyze it, and what Rhine brought was statistics had been used prior to Rhine, but he really kind of systematized how things were done, and statistical analyses came in. And then the problem is, how do we interpret the conclusion? Are we getting deviations from what we expect that are big enough to say, this guy's got telepathy, this is meaningful in the world? So these are the kinds of things that people were thinking about, and what spurred this change in how parapsychology was investigated. And as Carlos said, one of the probable emotional causes was that the Rhines themselves had been involved prior to the founding of the parapsychology lab at Duke with mediumship research, and had a sitting with Marjorie, who is a very famous and many people feel fraudulent medium who was operating here in New York in the 20s. And I think for them it was a very messy kind of a thing compared to botany, where they came from, and they wanted to try and find a way to do this research that had for them very big meaning, you know, very deep meaning. They were both very interested in survival. They were both very interested in providing a basis for religious beliefs, but they wanted to do it in a way that was very systematic, very clean, very easy to control. The next slide. So 2 types of methodologies basically grew up, and the Rhines are most associated with the first one, forced choice, and that's where you set up an experiment in which there's a limited number of specific targets. They might be cards, they might be numbers, they might be colors, they might be objects in a box. When computers came in, this changed into doing ESP tests in computers. One of the very first ones was developed by Chuck Honorton in the 80s. You remember, some of you may be old enough to remember Space Invaders. Do you remember this old game? Very kind of, kids today would just die. Very boring, little things going across and you shoot at them. And Chuck set up a version of this thing that he called Invaders, in which you could only win by using your PK or using your precognition to interact with the machine at a particular moment. So it was set up for you to lose. It was set up for you to get blasted into oblivion by these little guys that were marching down the screen, and the only way that you could win was to show either some ESP or some PK, and it was all the rage for a while. Now there are much more interesting versions of ESP games out there that are computer-based. The second type of methodology is something where the metaphor for spontaneous experiences is much closer to what the experience actually is, and this is called free response methodology. In free response methodology, you have an open-ended target set. The person can respond, either the target is drawings, photographs, geographical locations, illustrations, film clips, and the person who responds is not just saying, okay, here, you know, show me these four and I'll pick this one now, and then I'll pick that one, and then I'll pick this one. You're allowed to go into an altered state, to come up with imagery, to draw, to write, to do anything you can think of to pull up some connection with this target material. And then the question becomes, how do we analyze that experiment? How do we take the drawings you produce and the things that you say and relate them back to the target material? So free response methodology is closer in terms of its metaphor for what really goes on in life than forced choice methodology, but it's also more difficult to analyze. And I think before computers, it was probably pretty onerous to analyze, whereas now it's not so bad. What's really not known usually is that this kind of methodology was also going on in Rhine's laboratory. The next slide, I think. Oh no, do you have Dorothy's daughters? Oh, that's later, so just the next slide is fine. Rhine's laboratory, down a bit. Rhine's laboratory had a researcher whose name was Charles Stewart, and his job was to kind of go against the grain of what was going on in that unit. He wasn't doing card tests, he was doing free response drawing experiments. And when he died during the war years of a heart attack at a very young age, which shows you how social factors get involved in how science moves forward. Don't let anybody tell you that science moves only by objective methods, because there's all kinds of social things that get involved. The people in the parapsychology laboratory, even though Charlie was getting some interesting results with his drawing experiments, just couldn't bring themselves to carry them on after he died. It was too painful. So it became a forbidden methodology in Rhine's laboratory. And when Chuck Honorton went to the laboratory in the 60s as a very young man, he was unable to get permission to do those kinds of experiments, and actually was at one point doing secret experiments in the basement of the building, having his subjects come in the back door after hours because Rhine didn't want him to be doing any free response work. So now, though, I think we value more as modern researchers this idea that the metaphor should really be close to what the experience is. So the free response methodology is more interesting. It allows you to get at more of the psychological abilities or the psychological set of what it is that makes somebody able to do ESP. You can get people's imagery. You can look at what kind of imagery they produce. Do they make mistakes in the way that they interpret what they're seeing? We had experiences in the first set of Gonsfeld experiments that we did at the Rhine Center in the 80s. We had a lot of people who just came over the wall from Duke University and were your regular 19-year-old college sophomores. And they didn't have any investiture in how well they did in the, it was just a great thing to do, and they came in and they ran the experiment, and some of them did really well. But we also had a number of special subjects, some of whom were working as psychics in North Carolina. And they came in very anxious, and no matter how many times you told them, listen, we know that psychic phenomena does not function every single day, that you can't be right all the time. We don't expect you to get a hit just because you work as a psychic. They would still come into the room with performance anxiety. And in an experiment that I ran, we literally had 2 sessions in which, well, one in particular stands out in my mind. The receiver, so she's the subject, was a psychic from North Carolina, and she got farm fields, she got farm buildings, she got green fields with flowers in them, she got trees, she got tractors, she got barnyard animals. And when we gave her the 4 pictures at the end, because the situation is in the Gonsfeld, you relax in your chair, you go through a relaxation technique, and then for 30 minutes you bring your information to the surface. You try to get information about what's being sent to you. At the time we didn't have a computer set up, so we were working with photographs from the National Geographic, which the sender would have on another floor of the building and be staring at and trying to send. When we brought in her 4 photographs, one of which was her target and there were 3 others, she walked right away, took that farm scene and put it over to the side and said, no, that can't be it. And spent the rest of the evaluation procedure trying to match her imagery to the other 3 targets. And as an experimenter, you're not allowed to say, excuse me, it's supposed to be their experience. And we had that happen with another psychic as well. So there was something about the anxiety that she was going through, whereas when we gave her pictures, her mentation, and the same set of pictures to an independent judge, they matched it up right away. It was really clear that the target that we had the sender looking at, that farm scene, was what she was picking up. But she was so anxious in the judging that she just literally picked it and put it aside. We also had another person, which is another reason why this type of experiment is really interesting, because you find out something about preferences and about phobias and about how people process information. We had another person who was had been talking through their entire mentation period about spiders and cats. And when we brought in the 4 pictures at the end, and we would have sets of pictures that were there for the experimenter in the experimental room, and then we'd have duplicates that were in the other part of the building for the sender. So we get our 4 out of the envelope and we spread them out, and there was a painting of a cat peeking around a door at a spider, and he immediately moved it a little bit and rated the other 3, gave that one a 4, and I was sitting there biting my lip. The person who was listening in the booth was biting their, it was like, wait a minute, all you talked about was, and this is over here. Later he started to talk about, we started to ask him for his, how he felt about these pictures. What were the emotions when he finished his judging, just informally? What was your emotions as you saw all these different pictures? Well, I have a phobia of spiders, so I don't even want to look at that one. So it was his phobia worked in the sense that he got the information about the target, but he couldn't bring himself to say, yes, I did. So in this kind of experiment, you get all this extra information that you can't get from people guessing cards. So there's basically 3 different kinds. The drawing experiment, in which it just means that the target is being drawn. In the old days, they used to take a dictionary out for the sender and they just kind of find something and draw it. The receiver draws their response, and then the experimenter attempts to evaluate those correspondence. They look for the type of picture that's produced, the color of it, the shape, and if it evokes a kind of an emotion. 2 of the newer ways of getting at this is remote viewing, and this is where you have an outbound experimenter who is going out to a target that's a physical location. And the outbound experimenter's job is to either take someone with them to scan the environment, look at it, and try and send it to the receiver in the laboratory, or the outbound experimenter does it themselves. And you just kind of experience the environment. In some experiments, you would take photographs. In other experiments, the outbound experimenter would sit down and draw pictures and write impressions of that location. In the laboratory, it would be like drawing experiments in the sense that you would have somebody sitting in the laboratory with, like, say, Russell Targ in that example, who would be in a normal state of consciousness, not go through a relaxation technique, not try to put themselves in any kind of altered state, and just start talking about where they think that outbound experimenter might be. The receiver might talk, might draw, might just give impressions of what they think the outbound experimenter is doing. And then the evaluation would happen in different ways. Sometimes people would be given all 10 of the target locations and they'd have to match up all 10 of the transcripts from 10 different subjects. People stopped doing that because sometimes there's a difficulty there. You say, okay, this one matches, so now you're not going to consider that for the second set of transcripts. So then they moved to a methodology similar to Gonsfeld in the sense that you would have a single outbound location and a pool of the possibles that the person really didn't go to. And you again would be looking at the shapes and the color, guesses at the location, use of buildings, that kind of thing. This was begun by Targ and Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute. John Bisaha was a professor of mine at Mundelein College in the 70s, did a number of these experiments with Brenda Dunn, who is now the laboratory manager at the Pear Lab at Princeton University. And when she moved to Princeton University, they started talking about how hard it was to evaluate these things. When you just have somebody saying, like you've seen in the examples, you have somebody saying, oh, I see a long building, I see wood, I see water, I see boats, let me show you what it looks like. So how do you evaluate that? So the Princeton group at the Pear Laboratory, what they did was they came up with a checklist. You would let the person who is the receiver just talk about anything that popped into their heads, but when they finished, they would have to go down a set of questions. Was it inside? Was it outside? Was it dark? Was it light? Was it raining? Was it sunny? Was it, all these different, were there buildings? Were there people? And then the checklist would be matched up with a similar type of checklist put together by somebody about the target locations. And then they would do a statistical analysis. It made it easier to deal with the information that they got in the experiment, but they found as the receivers, even the really good ones, got used to doing this procedure, they would stop giving them any kind of information that came into their heads. They would stop free responding. They would start saying, well, they're inside, it's dark, there's a building. So the questionnaire actually began to shape the experiences. They recently published, which isn't in this library only because I haven't brought it in yet, but they sent it to me, so I'll bring it in. They recently published a 20-year review of all of their remote perception research, and that was something that they talked about, that this is a little sad, that even though they came up with a technique that really makes life easier for the experimenter, it actually messed things up for the people who had the psychic ability. So there has to be a better way of doing it. Chuck Honorton, and I'm going to sort of fly through some of the ways this developed, came up with this technique, and at the same time William Broad on the West Coast also developed it. And this idea is they took a methodology that was being used in vision research called the Gonsfeld, and the idea was that you put a person in a single visual field with no features, and there you are starved for information, and because you're starved for information, you start getting a lot of internal imagery. And the whole idea is, what can we do to make the person bring up more things from their own minds and maybe then come into contact with the target? So he started to use the Gonsfeld, and you saw that transparency at the end of Carlos's lecture of Ellen Messer with her ping pong balls. The deal there is you put somebody in a very comfortable chair with the ping pong balls, you have white noise. They started using a 22-minute relaxation technique, so you're really nice and sleepy by the time you get to the period where you're supposed to generate imagery. We had a problem in Durham occasionally that if you didn't actually say, how are you doing, sometimes they fell asleep. And 30 minutes later you're, excuse me, did you get anything? So you have to keep them moving, basically. And we'll take a look at some of these details very quickly in a few minutes. But so this was another way to come up with a metaphor for spontaneous experiences that would keep that richness, but put it in the hands of the experimenters. And one of the other big things that Chuck Honorton did, as you could see in the clips, is he added moving targets. He added a computer control system so that all of the banks of videos and all that stuff were all controlled by the computer. The experimenter didn't know what the subject was being shown. And so there was a way to make sure that the situation was being controlled for the scientific part of it, as well as keep everybody interested in what was happening and maybe get something that was like ESP in life. The next one. This is an old drawing experiment from Warcollier that was done in the 20s, and it just shows you the kinds of target materials they were using then and the kinds of things that the percipients would draw, and then you'd have to try and figure out how like that canoe is the canoe that percipient B drew. So it gave you a lot of problems in terms of analysis. The next one. This is proof that they did drawing experiments in the Rhine laboratory. These are twins, and they were in 2 different rooms in the laboratory, and that odd little box that's on the wall there with a white button, these were signaling devices that would tell them both, now you start sending, now you start receiving, and that way they control the timing of the experience. This one is here for absolutely no reason other than that. Dream telepathy research started in the Parapsychology Foundation at, under the auspices of Mrs. Garrett, when Stanley Krippner, who was a very well-known psychologist, was here. He was involved with Montague Ullman. They started the dream telepathy work here. They went from here to Maimonides, where Montague Ullman was the head of the dream lab. And then out of Maimonides, that's where Chuck Honorton got trained and a lot of other researchers got trained. Ed May, who took over the government's remote viewing program from Targan Puthoff, did some time in the Maimonides lab. So everything started here, just to tell you it started here. Next one. This is an example of a dream telepathy target, because in the Maimonides era, of course, they weren't showing film clips. So again, it was paintings or pictures. And also to show you how very much like life these kinds of things are. This was being shown to the sender, because this is a long experiment. You've got a sender sitting in a room all night long, and the receiver is in the dream lab. Every time rapid eye movement is seen, they wake that person up and have them tell their dreams. And then they go back to sleep again, and the sender's still in there trying to stay awake. So they would give them multimedia things to do to depict the picture. A nice Christian fellow is trying to send this, and a Jewish man is in the laboratory. He dreamed about the synagogue, he dreamed about the Torah, he dreamed about the cantors. He had a lot of religious imagery and was able to pick his target out of a group, because this was the only one with religious imagery. But he took that information and personalized it. So it shows you something of how it works in life. This is from the May period of SRI. Now what was going on there was, unbeknownst to us, and we all suspected it, these group of guys out there in California always had money, always came to the conventions, always had something to say. And most of us in parapsychology, scientific parapsychology is not a great way to make a living. Everybody's broke. And there's not a lot of funding and not a lot of research money out there, especially not from conventional sources. And these guys always had money. So we always suspected that the government was involved somewhere. And in fact, it was. Stargate was the program that started with Targan Puthoff's remote viewing laboratory and was declassified in 1995. A lot of the remote viewers that now have established remote viewing schools, and you can find them on the internet, were actually military personnel who were trained to do these kinds of things. And what they were looking for was a way to do safe spying, so that you could have a guy in a room in Washington tell you what was going on in Tasmania, and you wouldn't have to go over there and get bitten by something. Although that's probably a wonderful place, Tasmania. Anyway, you can't quite see this picture. After they got declassified, we started to actually get some of this research, because that's the other negative consequence of taking money from the government. You're not allowed to publish. So we don't know what's happening. The rest of the field loses out. And you lose out, because you don't have colleagues to talk to, that kind of thing. So this was one of the experiments in which a remote viewer was trying to get an outbound location and drew a very good depiction of it. They had some remote viewers that were very, very good at technology and at technical specifications of places. The government tells us that they canceled the program because the information was good. There is such a thing as ESP, but they couldn't use it to spy with. It wasn't specific enough to spy with. I don't know if I believe that. But anyhow, that's what they say. Next one. This is the Gonsfeld suite at the Kessler Parapsychology Unit at Edinburgh, where Carlos and I were for a number of years. In fact, when the first 4 subjects were the first 4 greatest hits that you saw from Kathy Dalton, Kathy Dalton's tape. Kathy Dalton was a researcher there doing her PhD, and in 94 and 95 she did 120 subjects, one experiment, 90 in another. And this was the physical setup. Now this is one thing that we try to do, and it's in response to criticism about the way parapsychologists do research. That is to try and control all aspects so that when somebody comes and says, oh yeah, they're passing notes, that's how they know what the sender and receiver are cheating. You set up a situation like this. Chuck Honorton actually developed this laboratory after his lab closed. He went to Edinburgh and developed this. The receiver's room is like a bank vault. It's got 2 sets of walls with insulation in between and 2 interlocking doors. The video room is exactly the same, so it can be closed off, and there's contacts on the doors, so if those doors are open during the experimental procedure, an alarm goes off, everybody knows it happened. Inside the video room is where the video banks are, and there's 2 banks with 2 sets of target pools, so the experimenter doesn't know which target is getting picked. The experimenter sits in the room next to the receiver, and then as you come up the hallway, the sender is all the way down here in another office down the hallway. All of these offices are students and faculty members in the parapsychology unit at the University of Edinburgh. In fact, Carlos wanted me to show you that this was our office. This was done primarily, again, there's a contact point on that door for the sender, primarily so we could say if there's a hit like one of the greatest hits where they're really talking about things that you're seeing in that target material, and it's obvious that information went from the sender to the receiver, that they can't come with some other kind of, you know, it was fraud, they got out of the room, they snuck in there. So these kinds of precautions can be taken. You want to make them completely invisible to the subjects, however, because it's like the remote viewing experiment. You don't want to make anybody anxious. You don't want to make them nervous. You want them to feel comfortable and happy and have them enjoy the experience. There's a couple of ways to look at experimental research in parapsychology and also to look at spontaneous case research. You look at proof, you look at process. Proof means I'm trying to prove that ESP exists or doesn't exist. I'm trying to show you that this is psychic functioning is out there in the world. We feel like in the field of parapsychology, we left the proof stage 80 years ago. The critics feel that we haven't even gotten that squared away. One of the problems now is that a lot of us do what's called process research, which we're looking at what target is better, what person is better, do you have to have a receiver and a sender related to each other? All kinds of things that tell us about how psychic functioning works. That's what we're interested in. And they tell us we can't do that yet because we haven't proved it. You can use special subjects or unselected subjects. A special subject will be somebody with proven psychic ability or somebody who claims to have psychic ability. Unselected subjects is what Dr. Ryan was always doing, which is let's get everybody in here and see who's got what and how many of them have something. Quantitative is when you can put it through a statistical analysis. At the end, qualitative is when we're looking at all those features. We want to know, is somebody always talking about the emotions and not about the visuals? Is somebody always talking about the visuals and not the emotions? Next one. So these are some of the results from the Gonsfeld stuff. Chuck was responsible for finding that moving targets are better than static ones. So the receiver is much more able to pick up a motion picture with a lot of content than they are just a photograph. If it's a great photograph, it gets through. One of the first experiments that I was in Chuck Honorton's laboratory, and it was kind of a bizarre situation because I was young and single. And the experimenter who was listening to me talk about my mentation was young and single, and my sender was a good girlfriend of mine, and I kept getting all this Wild West whorehouse imagery. You know, all these ladies in their bustiers around the bar and cowboys in bedrooms, and I thought, I can't tell him this stuff. So I would say, oh, I see red flecked wallpaper, and I see a bed, and I see a window, and it's dusty outside, and there's guys with boots. And then every once in a while I would fess up and say, oh, I see a woman in a big hat and she's wearing a bustier, and okay, so I see, you know, rugs in the hallway. Well, it turned out that what I was being sent, and I was able to pick it out when they gave me my 4 pictures. I had Marilyn Monroe in a still from the movie Gay 90s in her fishnet stockings and her bustier and this big hat. I had a lady with 2 seals I had a boat going in front of a building, and I had a roast beef on a plate. So I had no trouble picking my target. And my sender said to me what she found astonishing was, as the sender, you see a clip for as long as the clip goes. And then there's a period of darkness. So you're actually sitting in the sender room in the dark. Sometimes these are anechoic chambers, which means that they're completely insulated and you can hear your heartbeat when the movie isn't on. It's kind of not nice. And then the picture would come on again and you'd see it. So you'd either see a film clip or you'd see a picture, but there'd be moments of darkness in between. And when I finally fessed up and said, oh, I see a woman in a big hat, the picture had just come back on and she'd focused on the hat, so she said it gave her the willies. But it was a good experience. So he's found that moving targets were better than static ones. Targets with emotional context, like the ones that you saw there, somebody's struggling, somebody's worried, somebody's afraid. Those are the kinds of things that come through more often. Kathy Dalton's contribution to the field, which actually started with Chuck Honorton here at Juilliard. He and another experimenter in I think the 70s or the early 80s, took a group of musicians and creative artists and writers from Juilliard and did an experiment with them, and their hit rates were so much higher than your regular college sophomore. What Kathy Dalton did was to only recruit musicians and different types of visual artists, computer-generated, people who did computer art, writers, actors, sculptors, and do Gonsfeld experiments with them. She also tried to do research on their creativity levels and their personal experiences and so on. And these people are extremely good at getting psychic information and at having psychic functioning in their lives. So it's not just all of us, definitely not all of us that have this ability. Persons who have had spontaneous experiences in life are much better at doing ESP research, particularly free response in the laboratory. And recently people have discovered that if you've got sender-receiver pairs who are close, parent-child, a couple of people in a love relationship, they're going to do a lot better than two casual friends, or having the subject come in the laboratory and you say, okay, you see this guy over here that you've never met before, he's the one who's going to send you the target. So the bonded pairs are the ones that seem to do better, and that makes a lot of sense when you think about how spontaneous experiences work. Next one. They also found out that people who practice mental disciplines like meditation, Tai Chi, any kind of activity that gives you experience at turning inward is very good is correlated with being very good in the Gonsfeld or very good in a free response situation. And then there's quite a bit of work that's being done on the psychology of people who do well in experiments and people who report psychic experiences. And this is part of that. The Mbti is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which looks at Jungian personality types. And then the Neo-PI is another personality inventory that looks at a variety of personality types. And what seems to be very important now is this notion of openness to experience. Artists and musicians tend to be very high on openness. If you're very high on conscientiousness, forget about it. You're not going to get a lot of ESP in the laboratory. People who believe in their own ability to show ESP, or that ESP actually happens, are more likely to do well in experiments. And this is also a finding that came out of New York. Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler, who used to be at City College, actually did a study in the 1940s in which she divided up subjects after the experiment was finished on the basis of what kind of level of belief they expressed. Did they believe that ESP could happen? Did they believe they could do ESP? And she separated people out into sheep and goats. And the goats were the people who didn't believe that they could do it and didn't believe it would happen. And she found consistently in her research and in other research down the decades that there is a differential. People who believe that they can do it and believe that it happens do better in the experiments. There's an interesting experiment that came out in the late 1970s from an undergraduate from University of Chicago, in which the goats were the ones that had the high ESP scores, but it was in the reverse direction. They had avoided the target so well that their end of the experiment was very significant statistically, which we all thought was kind of interesting. Next one. Okay, so these are some of the things that we're finding from the free response literature that fit with what we know about spontaneous experiences. That things can be unintentional. You can set up an experiment where the person doesn't know what they need to do to win at the experiment, to do well, and they'll still do well. You don't have to have an awareness of what's happening. You can be in an altered state. There are actually some studies that show that you don't actually have to have a sender in that room. You can have that target clip just playing on the video monitor and the room locked up and the receiver is still getting information. But what seems to be important is that the receiver thinks there's somebody seeing the clip and sending the clip. That spontaneous psychic experiences are important. If the person who's in the experiment has had them, they'll do better. That you can find evidence that they're getting information about the target through a physiological response. And then we're beginning to learn things about the complexity of the target. It's got to be interesting. It's got to have a lot of stuff going on. And these are some of the psychological findings. This sheep goat. If you take a look at our website under PsyInfo, there's a glossary of terms, and it defines these, because she used a passage in the Bible to come up with the words sheep and goat. And I can't remember the passage well enough to characterize it. Being a goat is not a good thing, I don't think, but anyway. We've discovered that people who are high on neuroticism don't do very well in the laboratory. People who are high on extroversion do well in the laboratory, but we tend to think that this is because it's a scary environment. That you've got to be the kind of person that can walk up those stairs to the Kessler unit, get greeted by a half a dozen people, they give you tea, they give you cookies, they try to be nice, but you've never met any of these people before. Then you get locked into this bank vault to do your receiving with your ping pong balls on your eyes. So extroverts tend not to get completely flipped out about that experience. So this may be an artifact of that an extrovert is more likely to feel comfortable in an experiment. People who get mental imagery tend to do better in these experiments, but that's not always the case. Altered states of consciousness help people turn inward and get that imagery out. And then there's been a series of experiments done in the Netherlands, well, in Sweden, I guess, using a defense mechanism test that was developed to test pilots' ability to take in something threatening. Because if you're a fighter pilot, you need to be able to resolve something that you're seeing at a great speed that's threatening fast enough to make a successful response. So they decided to apply that test to ESP subjects and see that if a target was threatening, would somebody be slower to pick it up than if it was a positive kind of an image. And that's what you would expect, and that was what the findings were. So noxious targets, threatening targets, don't get through quite as well as the others. Got to be exciting, but not terrible. What have we got here? Well, this is awful. This is number salad, but what I'm doing here is just to tell you that people who say that there's no findings in parapsychology, we have no data, we have no reason to think that the proof phase is over, should read Dean Radin's book, what the heck is it called? The Conscious Mind? Conscious Universe. He does a really wonderful job of pulling together all of the findings back to the beginning of the field. And what these are results of statistical analyses called meta-analyses. And what a meta-analysis is you take all the experiments you can find of a particular type, you lump them together, you analyze them, and you take a look at how significant they are. Now you'll see up at the top it says all you need to know is that a value of 1.58 in the Z column means that it's significant. It means that it's 5 chances in 100 that that's a completely nothing result. And all of these values are quite a bit higher. D-mills, those are the experiments in which you're trying to influence somebody else's physiology. That's direct mental influence on living systems. Forced choice, those are the card tests. People did pretty well. Free response, actually it's a little bit less, but it's still very, very significant. And now there are many more studies. Dice throwing, RNG, these are random number computer kinds of games to test PK. And there's actually, we have a course on psychokinesis on video. Clairvoyance seems to be the least, well, almost the least of all of these. Precognition, still significant, Gonsfeld. And the auto-Gonsfeld, this is when it all got computerized and it all got systematized. So we're more sure about the results we're getting, but it may also be not so much fun for the subjects because it's a little bit more regimented, and not so much fun for the experimenters because it's a little bit more regimented. You're dealing with the computers. We're now getting more towards that point where there's parity between spontaneous case research and laboratory research. It still isn't quite the way we would like it to be. We'd like it to be really half and half, but we're getting there. Another way to look at spontaneous cases, besides talking to somebody and interviewing somebody and writing down what they're doing, is to give them a questionnaire. Have you ever had an experience in which you were awake and you thought that something was going to happen and you found out that it did, and it seemed like that was an ESP thing? Have you ever had an experience in a dream that seemed like you were getting information about something that you shouldn't have been able to get? Have you ever seen an apparition? Have you ever had an out-of-body experience? Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you think that you have had experiences that indicate that you may be reincarnated? Have you ever had contact with the dead? That could be through a medium or having a deathbed vision, seeing somebody, seeing an apparition is up there. Auras, seeing auras around people, or a PK type experience, like you walk into your living room and a vase that your favorite aunt gave you shatters, and you find out that it shattered at the exact moment that she died 1,000 miles away. These are 4 questionnaire studies. Palmer's was one of the most famous one. It was done in 1979 in Charlottesville. He gave questionnaires to 268 college students and also to townspeople. Chadha and Usha are both questionnaire studies that were done in India, and Zangari was a modification of the Palmer questionnaire, but it was given to college students in Brazil. And one of the things that we find really interesting about this is this is the percentage of the people who receive the questionnaires who are saying yes to the question. And in a lot of these cases, the Brazilians are saying yes to a lot, especially to contact with the dead, which is probably because of the prevalence of Spiritism as a real religion in a very organized, very powerful religion in Brazil. So this gives you an idea of different countries. This is the townspeople portion of John Palmer's experiment, and the Perkins experiment is one, or questionnaire study is one that Carlos and I did in the early 90s. Yeah, in the early 90s. And what we were looking for was an adult population that would be similar to the townspeople that John Palmer had interviewed. And again, we were looking for how many people were going to say yes, they had ESP dreams, yes, they had ESP impressions that came to them when they were awake, yes, they saw apparitions and so on. His was a random sample. Ours was done through coercion. We offered anybody that would take this questionnaire of Puerto Rican pineapple juice. And that was how we got our volunteers. Next one. These kinds of studies are really good at countering the criticism that, okay, maybe ESP exists, but it's so minor, so few people have it that it's not important. And when people have done random studies, and this is work that we did in Puerto Rico, and these were students in classes about parapsychology who helped us gather the data, so that's probably why there's more people with reporting more experiences. People will say that, they'll say, this is not important, you know, first I don't believe in it, but even if I did believe in it, there are so few people who can do this, why worry? When the random samples are done, which this wasn't a random sample, you find that about 10% of the population reports some kind of psychic experience. Well, 10% of the population is a lot of people. In Puerto Rico, that's 370,000 people. In the United States, that's 24 million. If 24 million people are having this experience, whether it's paranormal or not, it's extremely important for us to know why it happens, how it happens, and what it means. And trying to make that argument to the mainstream scientific community is like banging your head against a wall. As soon as they hear the word paranormal, parapsychology, that's it. They don't want to hear the next thing. We found through the experimental work and through some of the questionnaire studies that this notion that anybody who reports these experiences is mentally ill is just not true. There's a lot of range in the experiences that people have. And that's also important. But there are people who have these experiences and find them uncomfortable, difficult to deal with. and it contributes to having a problem. And we need to know about that too. Mainstream science doesn't want to hear about that. This is another example in spontaneous cases. People who report experiences or they answer questionnaires, this was from a summary that Stevenson did of experiences. Usually death is involved. It's very unusual for an experience to have a trivial thing behind it. You don't usually have a precognitive dream about losing a notebook or a pen or where to find the notebook or the pen. It's something with more content, and that's also true in the laboratory. You've got to have some interest going here. And this was, again, a comparison from different studies. The Sonnenwald questionnaire study was done in Germany after the war. Green was done in the 60s in Great Britain, Saltmarsh in Great Britain. Stevenson is a group of American cases, and then a group of Indian cases. One of the transparencies I would have shown you was just for fun, because it was something I prepared for a different lecture, which is a list of all the case collections going back to St. Augustine, City of God, in the 4th century AD, up to very recent studies like Sherry Cohn in Scottish Studies at University of Edinburgh on Second Sight in the West Highlands. So there's a lot of research that's been done, but the amount of research that's been done on spontaneous cases and questionnaire studies don't even come close to hitting the same amount as experiments, and we would like to see more parity there. These are things that have come out of the questionnaire studies, and Carlos does a lot of this research, so I think that's why we're going to go over this one way or the other. There's an inconsistent relationship between having a psychic experience. I had a whole section on spontaneous experiences. Reporting that you've had psychic experience, pathology and adjustment and mental imagery. The critics want to say that only pathological people report these experiences, and it's not true. We have found consistent relationships between reports of psychic experience and absorption is that psychological faculty that you have to really get into stuff. You know, you go to the movies and you're just completely in the movie. Levels of absorption are correlated with having reported psychic experiences. Dissociation, which it runs on a continuum from being able to dissociate a little bit from pain or to be able to move away from negative experiences in your life all the way up to pathological dissociation, which could be multiple personality. Dissociation also has a connection to psychic experiences, but we're not seeing only the people that are in need of help reporting psychic experience. It's all kinds of dissociation. So there's some good dissociation out there. Fantasy proneness, that's somebody who's very imaginative. People who recall their dreams, people who have vivid dreams, especially lucid dreamers, people who wake up in their dreams and know they're dreaming. They tend to report psychic experiences. And people who have mystical experiences tend to report psychic experiences. We know that lucid dreamers do better in the laboratory as well, and there have been studies done recently where we're looking at levels of absorption and dissociation and all these other things. Dream recall is frequently correlated with doing well. So all these things are kind of coming together in a way that we're getting a picture of who has psychic experiences, what do they mean, what do we know about the content of them and how they work. We may not know the mechanism by which the information gets from person A to person B, but we're beginning to understand more about what they mean and what's in them. So I think so you can't do any more. I think the point of this part is to show that the field has, you know, just as I was saying in the 1920s, here comes Ryan and he's decided the seance room scares him to death. He doesn't want to think about it. Let's have ESP cards. Let's have dice. Yeah, let's have nice little clean record sheets, and let's make this just like cognitive or classical conditioning in experimental psychology. Since the 60s, when we all know what was going on in the 60s, people are getting more comfortable with having a breadth of experience, with emotions, with trying to get into the deeper meanings of things, and that's also reflected in science practice in scientific parapsychology. We're also beginning to move back to that place where we really want to know the experiences that people have. We really want to understand how that functions in everybody's lives, and then yes, we want to do experimentation, but we want to make sure the experimentation is a good metaphor for what's happening to the person and not something that's so far afield from what real psychic functioning is that what you can learn is limited. So that's the lesson of my part. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Hi there.
My name is Lisette Coley, and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I want to welcome you to the Foundation's YouTube channel. There's already a wealth of information available posted, and we have plans to continue to post our classic lectures and new materials, so you don't want to miss out. So hit that bell, please subscribe, and you'll be notified. And hope you enjoy.